I'm a bit nostalgic for an era of the internet where cultural criticism was a little more blunt. It feels like a lot of critics are holding back. Today on the podcast, a new project trying to put a little more bite into culture writing, and also what we lose when critics get too polite. I'm Elamin Abdul-Mahmoud, and this is Commotion. Look, there was a time when the most feared culture critics had the sharpest takes. It'd give you the most biting one-liners, these takedowns of a failed piece of art. You might even say these takedowns were like a little mean. Delia misses that kind of criticism, so she started this pop-up blog called Hate Read, and that's where critics write about things that they hate. They hate the thing and they write about it. But here's the thing. They do it anonymously with no fear of retribution. I think her project raises a lot of interesting questions about where cultural criticism is at. So I talked to Delia about why she started it. And Niko, Stratis, one of our favorite culture critics, was there to weigh in on this experiment. I started by asking Delia to describe the era of mean culture critics that inspired Hate Read.
I think like everyone who's sort of maybe missed the peak of it and has mostly almost like heard about it more in these sort of romantic terms of like, oh man, you guys don't remember when Gawker used to run the internet and everyone just woke up in a cold sweat, you know? So I think like kind of coming up in media in sort of this post-Gawker era, that was just sort of the shining beacon of like what maybe we all were taught that like the peak internet, peak sort of like digital media, the Wild West days were like. Yeah. And so I think like you can't help but kind of buying into that romanticism a little bit of just like, wow, people just walked around and said anything they wanted, for good and for worse, for sure. Yeah. But I think now everyone is a bit like the internet is both smaller and bigger. And so I think just this yearning for kind of a you know, maybe like a bygone era, it definitely influences everything we do now.
Yeah, there's something really striking to me about the Gawker era because like when you try to describe it to people, you also have to give the background context of like this is an era when like media was a little bit less corporatized, a little bit less formal than it is now. And so the young people felt the freedom and the possibility to engage with art and go like, I kind of really hated that. And I'm going to write a short blog about it to let people know that I hated it. And then people could respond accordingly. And maybe you agreed, maybe you didn't agree. But the point was that it didn't feel restrained. It kind of felt like you could just say whatever is on your mind and there was no real limitation to the way that you engage with art. Can you give an example of a hate read right now that you're putting together that embodies this past era? Something that captures this sort of, I guess, tone of commentary.
I mean, can I talk about one that's already come out?
Yeah. You want to talk about one that maybe got the internet a little mad at you from this week? Okay, go ahead.
So earlier this week, we published an essay from a young media writer just about how much she hates media parties. And I think she sort of like shows her hand a little bit. She's like, you know, I came up sort of, you know, looking at what everyone was posting on Instagram stories and thinking that all these parties sounded so cool and they looked so cool. And she's like, you know, then I started going to them and I realized that they're really boring and that, you know, media people are really just like kind of not fun. And it turns out everyone just talks about work. Yeah. And so it's kind of very funny because she really roasts, I think, a lot of maybe like caricatures about the industry. Yeah. But I think at the heart of it, there is this sort of like this kernel of like real disenchantment. And I think it resonates because I think it reflects what a lot of people, you know, what I certainly thought like, you know, working in New York media was going to be like, it's just overall less sexy than you would ever want it to be.
That's not what I was promised when I was watching Sex and the City, but I appreciate that this point of view. But I think like this is a little bit of what is chafing against. Niko, your initial reaction to the idea of hate read. I want to get into like your thoughts about it now a little bit later, but first, let's talk about how your initial reaction wasn't so positive. Why? What was going on there? Being like hearing about this and going, I don't know about this.
I think I was surprised at my own softness. Like as a person, I am a person that makes things. I know it's funny. I'm wearing a cardigan today, and this is all sort of ties into. If you saw the thing, the Ringer went and found the drummer from Jet to talk to him about the famous Pitchfork review, where they just posted a photo of a monkey peeing into his own mouth as a review of the record, and
which was really mean. Yes, okay,
it's really mean. And he was talking about Phoebe Bridgers, and he was like, "I guess you would like it if you like cardigans," which is such a funny thing to like point out too, because also like cardigans are fine, man. But anyways, I have this, like, I'm a person who makes things, and like there is sometimes, and I get defensive about, like, if people are going to be mean, they're going to be mean to a thing that I made, and there's like a defensiveness.
Yeah.
So like when I first read about it, it's funny because now I'm being confronted because the person that made the thing is like is on the call with me. The call is coming from inside the house, just looking me in the eyes as I talk about this. But I thought about it for a second, and I was like, oh man, this is like we need this so desperately. Like we actually do, because like, look, I've written about Taylor Swift before. I know what it's like when you're like nice but not like fawning. Yeah. And it's just like, okay, well, I guess I have to consider moving. And look, I'm a trans person. I'm used to changing my name, but I don't want to have to do it a third time just because I wrote about a Taylor Swift album. You know what I mean? So there is this desire to be like, I also want to be able to be critical in a way that is maybe like finds the line and then sees just how far over it I want to go in a way that isn't going to like hurt my future chances at employment in this like very fraught and difficult industry.
I mean, I think this is the thing I want to pick up on, Delia. Like this idea that Niko just laid out, this idea that like we have gotten, more and more constrained in our ability to critique. I'm wondering if you can pinpoint for you the moment where cultural criticism seemed to have softened. When was that moment for you? As you sort of observed the trajectory of criticism?
I'm trying to think if there was one moment. I mean, I just remember there's a point where it felt like press tour Twitter had taken over, where, it just felt like I just remember vividly the day when the Don't Worry Darling crew was like in Venice, and there was that whole like, did Harry Styles like spit on Chris Pine
or did he not? Yes.
Yeah. And it just seems so sort of like a symptom of how starved people were for like wanting a little bit of conflict, wanting to like pull something apart and analyze it and dissect it. But it's like, this is like a promotional tour for a movie that we're not even talking about like the piece of art itself.
Yeah.
Again, this is a very maybe like utopian view, but I was like, we used to argue about books, and now, we just want to.
We used to be a society.
Styles is the thing or not. Yeah.
Niko, for me, I think it's got to be the moment. I mean, you mentioned Taylor Swift, so we're just going to do it. She has a song called "Mean," and the song is about the critic and cultural commentator who's still alive, Bob Lefsetz. He now has a newsletter, where he talks about the music industry. But she wrote this song that was kind of like a pushback against, that very thing, the idea of he can criticize her voice and he can criticize how she, appears on her album. But she just kind of feels like he's mean, and there's a meanness to his critique that is like not okay. When you think of criticism and how it's made the shift to this like different place where we maybe do pull our punches in ways that Bob Lefsetz did not feel like he needed to pull his punches, when do you think we started making that shift and criticism started being a little too mindful of the people on the internet who are going to get a little mad if you're not fawning over their artist?
We have always had people in culture that are like sort of the dominant figures of an era. Like this is a thing that has happened for time immemorial, but it sort of seems like, there was a thing in the day about how like Taylor Swift is like a new billionaire now, which congratulations, great year for rich people was the headline, which I'm still thinking about. But this idea of like pop stars are tied to capital is tied to websites, it's tied to clicks, it's tied to all these things. The teeth started to be ground away in favor of ensuring access to that same shared capital. And the more that happens, I think a lot about the Beyonce press tour right now and the PR tour, because there was a thing about how like, her team got you got right up to the camera.
I'm getting real close to the camera. Like, are you about to say a bad word about Beyonce? I'm joking. Continue. You
not at all.
Talk your talk.
But it is an interesting thing, because there was that article about like how her team organized and got her record into the pressing plan. Like, is it that her team organized, or is that she's Beyonce and she can call a record pressing plant and say, hey, I'm surprised dropping a record and you're going to press it immediately? And they said yes, because she is one of the richest people in the world.
Right.
And it's just like, the media around that and the conversation around that and the article around that isn't having that conversation because it doesn't want to be too toothy in case it loses access to that conversation.
Yeah.
Because this is the thing that drives clicks to these websites, the 4 websites we have left. There's also like, it's funny thinking about the Gawker thing, because at a certain point, people are only going to know Hulk Hogan as a guy that shut down a website,
right,
as opposed to like a guy that used to fight for different reasons. And we used to be a proper society where like we could have these sort of public entanglements, but now because we've tied everything to so much capital, it is harder than ever to have critical conversations about people who are like in the upper crust of financial society, let's say.
The very existence of hate read is making an argument that we lose something when we take away the meanness of cultural criticism. We lose something when we say, this is generally the territory you can play in and you can't really like push beyond that. What do you think we lose when we take away the meanness in criticism?
I mean, it's almost like sort of just like capping just the experience of human emotion, because I think like if you hate like, an album or, like a cultural work, if you hate it with a passion, like you're passionate about it. And I think that's as interesting to me if someone really despises this TV show and hear all these reasons, versus if someone really loves one and, then I want to know that too. So I think it's almost, it kind of like blunts the sort of range of emotions maybe you're like ever allowed to feel, or like you're ever allowed to feel about culture, which I think is like, that's so sad. That's the whole point. That's why we're here, right?
Niko, the scale of how you feel about Taylor Swift can only go from absolutely love to, yeah, she's all right. You cannot go anywhere below that. That is what Delia is saying here. But Niko, what do you think about this? What do you think about this idea of blunting human emotion as a consequence of losing meanness in cultural criticism?
I mean, I think that's true. It is like you are sort of putting boxes around how much you are allowed to express in your relationship to a thing. I mean, cultural criticism and is taking a piece of culture and putting it in context in the world around it and having a conversation. And if you have to hold yourself back on being too mean, we're using the word mean a lot, but really what you're doing is being critical. And sometimes being critical veers into territory that some people might brush up against, just as I did when I first read about the idea. And that's the thing. We should be sort of forced into these zones where we feel a little bit uncomfortable when somebody's being critical of a thing, because it forces us to feel a different emotion, which is important, and B, question why we're feeling that different emotion and have a conversation about that. Every time The Cut publishes a personal essay, we have 2 days of discourse about it. And no one really wants to talk about the fact that they love having that discourse about it because it causes us to think and feel and have a conversation. And we've kind of fallen away from that world in favor of, always having the fawning reviews. We do sort of need to see the line and walk over it, because I think once we're over it, that's where we're going to have a real conversation about a thing.
I would say also we are in this precarious time in media. There have been these waves of layoffs across Canada and the US, which means a lot of critics have to do this work as freelancers. Maybe, Niko, I'll go to you. You're a freelance critic. What kind of vulnerability do you think that opens up in terms of critics who have to do this work, but they also have to do it as freelancers? They're just not as secure in their employment.
I mean, look, I'm a 41-year-old sober trans woman. I'm not exactly the most well-represented demographic in media as it is. And like, if I'm really critical of a thing, it makes me worry that I'm not going to get, more work, or that people are going to pay less attention to me or whatever. There is a social capital tied to your opinion of these massive pieces of culture. And for a lot of culture critics that are more freelance than ever, especially people that live in marginalized, or that are from marginalized communities, it is a harder than ever thing to be critical of the darlings of pop culture, whatever they may be. And it really does, like, we not only need to hear people that don't like a thing, we need to know where they're coming from, because everybody's going to have a different inroad. We talk about this like meanness and the critical, there is a race and gender and, class conversation that are all inherently tied into this as well, as like, where is your approach coming from?
If we're trying to get back, Delia, to a place where, there's still honest, maybe meaner criticism, is doing it anonymously the answer? Because you've provided the space in Hate Read for people to come out and go like, give me the thing that you hate, just lay it on me, go all guns blazing. But also you can call yourself Dickie Minaj and hide behind. Well, first of all, I want to know who that is right now. But more importantly, I think like why anonymously? Why is that the approach?
I've been thinking about this project as a bit of a social experiment, because I wanted to see like what would people write about if they have anonymity, but also what will people say if they know that the writer, there's no like kind of real person to pin their critique on. So because someone was sort of like, oh, it's interesting how that anonymity protects people both ways, because if you find out who, this writer is, then you can't be out here tweeting like this writing is terrible, because they're going to see it. So it's kind of, I think that's kind of funny. But I don't think this would be I wouldn't want this to be like an on-running, like, anything that isn't a pop-up, because I think that's the experiment that's sort of fun. I think in a better world, we sort of understand that like criticism is not an attack, in the same way that, how people are like, oh, conflict is not abuse. It's sort of like, we should all just like sign an agreement that's like, yes, we can say stuff about each other's work. And then we can go, to drinks and like look each other in the eye and just be like, okay, I respect that you didn't like it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think I'm like, I don't think this could last forever, but I do sort of like the general paranoia it kind of injects, because now everyone's like, well, who is it? Is it someone I know? Do people walk among us, with the thought? So I like that as just a very temporary thing.
I see that you're not going to name names, and I hate it. Thank you. Delia, so the pop-up has been live for a week. What have you learned in the week that Hate Read has been live?
I was joking with someone in the aftermath of the media parties thing, which just like riled everyone in the industry up. And I was just like, I just really thought we were all like more mentally resilient than this. I have a very like normal friend who doesn't work in the industry, and she's like, oh, I've been loving reading these. I just think I read it and then I think, do I agree? Do I not agree? And then I move on with my day. Yeah. And I was like,
normal reaction.
I forgot. That's normal people. This industry, it's like, this is wrong and I must be heard.
Delia Kai is the editor of Hate Read and D's Links. She was in Brooklyn. Niko Stratis is a freelance culture critic, and she writes the newsletter Anxiety Shark from Toronto. Okay, just hang on. Commotion will be back in just a moment. All right, we're back. My name is Elamin Abdul-Mahmoud, and this is Commotion. There is a distributor that acts as a middleman to bring books from publishers to sellers, and then to you, the reader. In the U.S., there are very few independent distributors left. One of the longest-running, Small Press Distribution, or SPD, just folded very suddenly after 55 years in operation. Here's why this is a big deal. SPD supported more than 400 small publishers across the U.S. Some of those publishers are now owed money by SPD, like a lot of money. Black Lawrence Press is one of those publishers. Its executive director told Literary Hub, quote, "The small press world is about to fall apart." Jane Friedman is the editor of The Hot Sheet. It is a newsletter about the publishing industry. She's also the author of The Business of Being a Writer. Jane, thank you for being here to unpack all of this.
My pleasure.
Listen, let me just start by asking you your reaction. What was your reaction to the news that SPD was closing so suddenly?
Shock, because when a distributor closes, there's a really long wind-up or dissolution, or like people have to get their books to another place. It's right. We're talking about 300,000 books that SPD was handling, actual units. And so to say today we're stopping and there has been no notice. Wow. I mean, now granted, SPD was on really uncertain ground. I think everyone in the community knew that. And so I don't think anyone was surprised that it might go away. But I think it was just the suddenness that one day they were shipping out books, literally, and the next day they were like, "We're done."
Yeah, usually you'd hear of some kind of wind down process. Okay, this is what's going to happen to our operation. Here's what you might expect. The idea that this would kind of come on suddenly. What I saw from a lot of my Twitter feed was just like this shock. Is like, can you even do that? That's quite wild. Can you just go a little bit into more detail in terms of what this means for the small publishers that they support?
Well, the most immediate problem is a logistical one. They have all of these books sitting in Ingram warehouse, or there's another warehouse in Michigan that's holding the books. And Ingram, for its part, has said, well, you need to let us know by April 17 where you want these books to go.
Oh, my God.
In 60 days. Will destroy them if they have not been claimed.
And Ingram is the biggest distributor in the United States, we should say. April 17th, correct. That's in a week. That's not a lot of time. Anyway. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, for a small press, keep in mind, these are typically run by volunteers, by people who have day jobs, by people who aren't doing this as something where they're sitting at their desk 24/7, you know? So they have to drop everything. And many small presses probably never expected to be looking for another distributor. They may not know who's willing to take them. And now they have to look at, should I bring these books back to where I currently live? Can I find a distributor in time? And obviously all this costs a lot of money to ship the books, and you only want to do it once. That's the first issue they have to figure out quickly. The next issue is all of the money that may be due. So SPD they paid quarterly to these presses, and they haven't made a payment for the last quarter. And at minimum, it could be going back further. It probably depends on the press when they last received a sales report or when a last payment came in. I know one press that's owed $40,000. That's Rose Metal Press. And for some of these presses, that's, that could be half of their annual sales, 3/4 of their annual sales. And unless they have a cushion, this impacts their ability to pay author royalties, to continue printing books, to continue to operate.
Of course. We got maybe a couple of minutes left here, so let me just ask you this. Kent Watson is executive director of SPD. He announced a closure in a statement on the company's website. He said, quote, "Several years of declining sales and the loss of grant support from almost every institution that annually supported SPD have combined to squeeze our budget beyond the breaking point." He seems to be alluding to some larger forces at play here. With a couple of minutes left, what do you think he's referring to?
Well, I mean, he's correct that it's a challenging environment to get arts funding, at least in the United States. All arts organizations face this challenge. I don't think SPD was, well, let me back up and say SPD faced some criticism for labor conditions. And this is going back to 2020. And I'm not sure it ever really recovered from the criticism. It may be that funders in its state or in its region did not want to fund them any longer.
Right.
So that may have been playing a role.
Yeah.
But SPD also just completed this enormous transition of its inventory to a new warehouse. So it was in the process of moving. And as we all know, moving ends up costing more than maybe you anticipated. So it was probably a confluence of factors that led to the abruptness.
Look, this is a distributor that handles books from very small presses. They publish a lot of poetry, a lot of experimental literary fiction by new voices. What do you think we lose when a place like small press distribution disappears?
We need small presses to take risks. I mean, the really big five or the big conglomerates are not taking risks on this level. They're also not necessarily looking for emerging voices. You'll find some well-known authors coming out of SPD presses like Nell Zink or Sherman Alexie, Patricia Lockwood, whose poetry titles or their early career titles are from some of these presses. So, they really preserve the arts and culture.
Do you think when you think about the publishing industry and how it thinks about small presses, are there a lot of protections for small presses, or does this kind of expose us to the reality that actually they're not very well protected at all?
They're not well protected at all. So they do have another organization that's helping them currently called the Community of Literary Magazines and Small Presses. And so we're hoping that support is going to get them through this rough patch.
Well, I really appreciate you being here, Jane. I am so interested in this story because the reaction that I saw to it was quite, significant. And I don't think I'd been hearing from a lot of people about like the way that small presses have been affecting their lives. And then you lose small press distribution, and then suddenly there's so much interest, there's so much panic, I guess, as a reaction. And we learn how important they are in the ecosystem, right?
Yes. I mean, they're fundamental for the arts, for poetry, for literary fiction, for things that are not commercial enough for a big publisher to take on.
For sure. Well, I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Of course. Jane Friedman is the editor of The Hot Sheet. It is a newsletter about the publishing industry. She's also the author of The Business of Being a Writer. We reached her in Cincinnati, Ohio. That is it for the podcast today. Also, I don't know if you know this, but we've been trying to experiment with putting some more stuff up on our YouTube. You can find us on the CBC Podcast YouTube page. For example, we've been airing our Friday group chats live directly to YouTube, so I highly recommend you check those out. We are on Instagram, if you got the time for that. We are at Commotion CBC. My name is Elamin Abdul-Mahmoud. Hey, I'm going to be back tomorrow. I hope you're going to be here because I enjoy doing this. I enjoy hanging out with you. I hope to see you then.